without further ado, let me introduce our speaker, Chris Fernandez Packham of the Age of Victoria podcast. Yep, come on stage.
Hello there. I hope everyone can see and hear me. It's lovely to be able to talk to you today about one of the great industrial disasters in British history, the Great Sheffield Flood of 1861, the disaster at the dam. I should warn you, of course, that as with any natural disaster or man-made disaster, there are some distressing moments involved, as is often the case with history. So just bear that in mind. Now, the Victorian era was a golden age of engineering, a time when engineers dreamed of incredible, never before tried projects. Bridges of a size never achieved in human history, great roads and railways, huge iron ships that dwarfed their ancestors with great funnels belching black smoke. Ancient Rome has a reputation for fantastic engineering, but the Victorian era not only matched it, but easily surpassed it. It wasn't just glamorous things like ships. The whole of the UK was undergoing the Industrial Revolution, one of the greatest changes to any society in the history of civilization. It required vast amounts of coal, water, and completely novel manufacturing techniques. Today, we are going to look at Sheffield, one of the great cities of the Industrial Revolution. Its ambitious project, upgrade infrastructure, keep up with the changes, the crisis at the new dam, the desperate and inadequate contingency planning, the disaster, the aftermath, and the lessons for civil engineering and disaster response, and of course, the human view on the ground. If you needed to pick a boomtown of the Industrial Revolution, well, Sheffield would fit the bill. It was a small town, 45,000 people in 1801. By 1861, it had a population of 185,000. That's a huge jump. By the 1860s, Sheffield was frequently covered in smoke from both industry and domestic fires. It had pleasant, rich areas, but much of it was dirty, damp, and unsanitary. Raw iron from Russia and Sweden flowed into the town on smoke-belching trains. It was smelted and beaten into fine steel, shipped across the kingdom and the world. It made some business owners fantastically rich and ground many working people's bodies into the wet soil of an early grave. Like all good boom towns, it had a huge number of really awful jobs, some bad enough to be picked up by Frederick Engels in his book, The Condition of the Working Class in England. Imagine, for instance, being a steel worker or a dry grinder, working on knife blades and forks on a whetstone, being paid a pittance to breathe in metal dust to make a fortune for an uncaring factory owner, and dying early. As Engels noted, the dry grinder's average life was only 35 years, and the wet grinders rarely got older than 45. But despite the industrial horrors, Sheffield saw some important cultural growth at the time. The inaugural meeting of the Sheffield Football Club was in 1857, and they became a vital part of the development of the rules of soccer by the FA in the 1860s and 1870s. Sheffield was a centuries-old producer of cutlery and knives, but in the 1850s and 60s, it was the place for steel and steel products. It was the industrial workshop of the world in many ways. The infamous Bowie knife might well have been the essential tool of the American frontier, but it was often mass-produced in Sheffield. Naturally, a massive industrial town needed railways, and so the Sheffield and Rotherham Rail in 1838 was quickly followed by the Sheffield, Ashton-under-Lyne and Manchester Railway in 1845, which had to overcome the hills and lakes of the Peak District and included the 3-mile long Woodhead Tunnel. Many crucial industrial developments were born in Sheffield, but all of this came at a price. The town needed water, vast amounts of water. Sheffield already owed its earlier industrialisation to its favourable position accessing water from local rivers. Sheffield is situated in Yorkshire at the foot of the Pennine Highlands, at a point where 4 streams, the Sheaf, Porter, Rivlin and Loxley, run in deep valleys to converge to form the River Don. Much of the surrounding countryside is staggeringly beautiful. Despite this, it needed more. In just 30 years, the local authorities had laid an extra 107 miles worth of water, pipes at a cost hundreds of thousands of pounds. The town needed new reservoirs. The Sheffield Waterworks Company was keen to provide them. It would mean plenty of contracts, subcontracts, and an army of navvies to move thousands of tons of earth with spades and muscle. One of these new reservoirs would be the Dale Dyke, also known as the Bradford Reservoir. It would be a classic embankment reservoir with a puddle clay core. It aimed to supply 12 hours of water to Sheffield a day, with extra for mill owners who had their flow from dammed rivers affected. It would be one of 8 new reservoirs. The embankment dammed the valley, capture the Dale Dyke River, also called Loxley. The new dam was 500 feet wide at the base, 100 foot tall, and 12 foot wide at the top. Like many early dams, it had a central core of impermeable puddled clay, supported on either side by less watertight but stronger material. This was just the kind of low-tech but ambitious project that Victorian city municipalities loved. This was the age when British self-confidence was unbreakable and things got done. People were pleased with the new reservoirs and life went on. The problems began to appear one stormy afternoon on the 11th of March, 1864. An unusually strong storm hit the area. The valley was a brutal place to be. Sheffield Water Company engineer, Mr. Gunsland, decided to make a precautionary inspection of the dam at 1500 hours. It seemed fine, although the water was noted to be only 3 to 6 inches below the top of the dam. He was reassured by what he saw and went off home. Later, a workman named Horsfield was trying to cross the embankment to get home. The wind was so strong he couldn't walk on the top, so decided to cross using the slope lower down to get shelter from the breeze. He noticed what seemed to him a long, paper-thin crack in the earth of the embankment, similar to the type he'd seen by frost in other large embankments. It was narrow, but nearly 50 yards long. He mentioned it to other workmen and a nearby farmer, then the local overseer, then other labourers and a contractor. A group assembled to inspect the crack. It was 1900 hours, and the darkness was falling, whilst the wind raged. Ominously, the group kept leaving their lanterns in the wind and having them blown out, and the torches flickered and died. The crack had widened to a couple of fingers' width. The group decided it was due to water ingress on the surface and settling, not a fundamental crack in the dike itself. As a precaution, the great sluice gates were opened, a hard, demanding job in Victorian times, nothing but human muscle to turn the huge wheels to open the gates in the cold, dark storm. Eventually, determination and pure grit got the sluices open, and thousands of gallons of water escaped. They anxiously checked the water level and saw with relief it was now below the level of the crack. The immediate danger seemed to have passed. The inspections showed that the ability to use sluice gates had prevented disaster, it seemed. Young Stevenson Fountain had been dispatched to get Gunson the engineer, whilst the crowd of onlookers drifted off home as workers and overseers said danger had passed. By 2000 hours, the engineers were inspecting the main of the dam. It seemed the crack was stable. They went to the waste overflow weir and found it was full, but not alarming. Still, they wanted to make sure, so decided to blast the waste weir open to drain it and allow overflow. They made a hole in the masonry and set the powder, then lit the train. But by some ill chance, some cursed turn of fate meant the gunpowder didn't ignite. Gunson went to check the crack, whilst the engineers desperately attempted to blow the powder. Some workers were sent to warn people nearby, but the situation still seemed under control. As midnight neared, and darkness was heavy, Gunson was on top of the embankment slope. When he looked up and saw the water was foaming and lashing over the top of the dam, pouring into the crack and onto his feet, he moved towards the valve house of the dam. But another engineer had realized what had strangely not occurred to Gunson. Anyone who didn't run was dead. They rushed out as a 30-foot crack split open the top of the dam, followed seconds too later by the boom of the gunpowder finally going off. 114 million cubic feet of water burst out of the dam and down the valley at 18 miles an hour as the dark and stormy night roared around it, drowned out by the sound of the water. The burst was followed by a second collapse, leaving a gap 110 yards wide and 70 feet tall. Many people sleeping in the houses in the valley and city below were already dead. They just didn't know it yet. The contingency plans had failed, and in the dark of the night, one of the greatest dam disasters in British history would kill hundreds. The sheer force of the deluge was incredible. Huge full-grown trees were uprooted, and a full stone bridge was simply swept away. Even rocks weighing several tons were carried in the vast flow. One farmer and his family at a nearby house received a few minutes' warning from a panicked worker. He managed to get his wife, 3 children, and some animals out up to higher ground. The flood hit minutes later, and the centuries-old stone farmhouse was erased from existence. The family were left in their nightwear, in the cold, dark wind and rain, but at least they were alive. The small village of Bradfield took a hammering, with 3 stone bridges carried away and numerous buildings wrecked. Panicked people fled as best they could. The first death was truly tragic. Mr. Dawson was woken up by his frightened wife. She'd given birth the day before. They grabbed the child and rushed out to try to flee, Mr. Dawson carrying them both in blankets. But once in the street, heavy floodwaters forced them back. They barely made it to their door when a huge surge hit them, ripping the 1-day-old baby from his arms and sweeping it away forever as he made the agonizing choice to save his wife rather than risk letting her go and swimming after the baby. Floodwaters were over 6 feet deep in places, and eventually they were helped to escape from the top floor window. Their child's body was found 4 days later in a coal cellar. The floods roared onwards. Some got lucky or made clever escapes. One farmer ripped the table legs off and bashed a hole in his roof to get his family up to safety. Others died due to complacency. Sheffield Harry, a worker at the dam, had gone home, laughing off the concerns of the engineers and his fellow workers. He mocked housemates who worried, and when woken in the middle of the night and told the flood was coming, replied they were lying, so he went back to sleep. He was never seen again. In some places, the flood was constrained by the topography, so crashed through as one massive wall of water rather than a rising deluge. In those places, whole families and buildings were simply wiped out. Village after village was just devastated. Finally, the water hit the city itself at Hillsborough and Oldham, 8 miles from the dam. The noise alone was likened to thousands of steam engines, or the roaring of hell itself. Even as the flood hit, the storm and wind in the night lashed people terrified in the darkness. One poor 17-year-old girl found the remains of her home, her family dead, and began to search for family possessions to sell on the spot. She knew that with her family gone in the disaster, she could soon starve to death in the aftermath. Locals bought up teacups and trinkets at inflated prices so the girl would have a chance. There were countless acts of heroism, neighbours breaking through walls to rescue neighbours, people pulling others from the water or helping them onto rooftops. One poor man had attempted to commit suicide that day by throwing himself in the river. He had been arrested and jailed to be tried for the crime of attempted suicide. In an almost final destination-like twist, his cell began to flood, and he was only rescued at the last moment. The flood swept through the city, including the most populous districts, the industrial sites, railway stations and workhouses. One factory alone suffered £2,000 worth of damage, a huge amount at the time. The build quality of the housing varied wildly, adding to the difficulties. There were no sandbags or flood defences, no mobile phones, radios, floodlights or blue light responders, just the roar of water, followed by fear and screaming in the dark. The aftermath was devastating. Streets covered in deep mud, debris, fallen trees and parts from buildings. Houses were missing walls, and the stench of sewage mixed with the smell of rotting river water. Some people in valleys spoke to find neighbours' houses downhill had just vanished. All around was the frantic search for the missing and the dead. Some bodies were found as far away as Doncaster. One 12-year-old girl was found chopped in half by debris. Another body was found high up in the branches of a tree. The final death toll was over 240 people of all ages, 4,357 houses flooded, and over 760 destroyed. The local police and army threw themselves into relief and rescue efforts. There were inquests, cries for blood in the press, and government inquiries, but no one was ultimately criminal liable. The design had been flawed, construction methods wrong. The contractors had cut corners to save money, and there was too much focus on company profits. The royal family started a relief subscription, and the taxpayers had to pay for the cleanup. And so the contingencies, the opening of the sluice gate, the reliance on the wastewater weir, and the blasting of the gunpowder had all failed. Poor construction, lack of risk management, ad hoc contingency planning, and lack of warning systems had meant disaster. Well, life is never risk-free, and history is not always pleasant. But I hope you've enjoyed this talk and that you now know a little bit about one of the great events that the city survived. Thank you.
Wow, that was really sad. And
Well,
does anyone have any questions? Like, okay, well, I have a couple then, and to get us going. The first one I'm going to ask you is, do we know, like, some of the thing, like, do we know what the long-term outcome was for some of the victims that you had discussed, like that 17-year-old girl, and I mean, these people who lost everything, what happened to them in the long term?
so there was a lot of good work by local journalists that tabulated all of the victims, but like a lot of things in the Victorian era, there wasn't a systemic follow-up to track individual outcomes so much, I'm afraid. With anything, it genuinely depended on your links with the community. If you had a good community to fall back on, and if you had a trade, it was quite likely that you would be okay. If you were orphaned or you didn't have a community, it was quite likely that you would have to move and find a new job very quickly. Or if not, the workhouse was very likely. And a lot of the people in the city were already in a precarious situation. 80% of the British population at the time were working poor. So it was already a very difficult and dangerous age to live in.
That makes sense. Um, do you think that there's anything that they did particularly well, like in comparison to modern standards, things that maybe they did better than us in handling this?
So I think one thing that was very important to the Victorians was a lot of individual energy. Um, there was a knowledge that if you didn't help yourself, no one was coming to help you. And that often translated to a more active engagement in the crisis situation, that people were more willing to take steps for themselves, but also to help neighbours much more aggressively. Whereas today, there is quite often in a crisis situation, when I was doing national contingency management for the UK government, one of the banes of our life was what we call the bystander effect, where everyone is waiting for someone else to respond to a disaster and the crowd just waits. And that was a little less prevalent in the Victorian age because no one was expecting someone else to help so much.
That makes sense, and that actually reflects some things that I've heard about, like, American history early on as well, some reflections that people have had on that. Steve asks if there were any safety measures that were brought in by the government or industry as a result of this tragedy.
Yes, there were a lot of inquiries, and it was very clear, firstly, that stakeholders had to be much tighter managed. So there was an expectation of much greater control of subcontractors by engineers and project leads. And then there were new regulations and practices around the size of the core of dams to increase stability. And there was also a much greater focus on the use of concrete foundations and extra drainage trenches. And there was talk about how to better manage water discharge safety using better valves and better piping techniques. But it wasn't quite a landmark safety change in the way that Titanic was for shipping regulations, which I think is the big comparison, that people sort of expect something this major to lead to that kind of sea change, and it wasn't quite like that.
dare I ask, why there wasn't?
Hmm. It was actually not because the government wasn't interested. It was there were limits to what they could understand about the collapse. The actual technology for reconstructing the incident was much more primitive. So it was much more reliant on eyewitness accounts and expert supposition of we think this happened because this crack might have appeared at this pipe, rather than being able to take soundings and geological surveys in the way that we did today. And a lot of the problems only came out when they talked to workmen who had been involved in the trenches, but no one would have asked them the questions beforehand, and it was only afterwards. But they were giving opinions of, I thought the ground was unusually wet here, but I didn't say anything because I assumed the engineers would have already noticed.
That makes sense. And has anyone gone in and done some like archaeological work to better understand the incident
Mm,
in the modern age?
yes, it has been quite well studied, especially the UK government released one of their civil engineering papers on the history of dam disasters. Um, but it was generally felt that actually, because people don't use the embankment techniques in the same way as much without the concrete reinforcement, that there's not quite so much to learn anymore. Um, and of course, when you look at this type of dam, you can go to places like Holland and study the big ones there. So it's much more of a site of historic interest rather than something to learn actively from in modern age. I think it's more interesting, how do we manage disasters in an unexpected situation? And I think that those lessons remain pertinent, that you should always pre-warn communities near large infrastructure. You should do planning with local authorities, councils, and with the individuals themselves, because it's no good relying on the first responders. You need an active and engaged community that knows when something happens, this is what we do, and this is how we prepare for it as individuals.
That makes sense. Um, Steve says, I guess technological limitations would also affect the measures that they could implement after the fact as well.
Yes, exactly. They did have some good technologies they could fall back on. There was an increase in concrete and brick support. It, the type of dam that they were using is still used today in places. It's a perfectly fine technique. It's just we're better at risk assessing them, and we tend to build them a bit thicker and bigger.
That that makes sense. Going to something you said a couple minutes ago about like pre-warning communities and individuals and preparing, do you feel like did that increase in terms of something that was done more after this event? And do those lessons still inform how people like do those things today?
Well, absolutely. I think that there's always been an awareness that if you build a dam, you are potentially exposing any downstream communities to risk, and that even the best dams can fail, and that the fundamentals are that you don't have a lot of time for the close-up communities to react, and you do have time for the further away communities to react. So it's a case of, can you get your message out quickly enough? And if not, should you be relocating communities from these at-risk areas? And if you can't relocate, what is your acceptable level of casualty and collateral loss amongst communities? And that is a judgment call for councils and governments to take about how comfortable they are with the risks.
And I would assume also with people moving into those communities now, or not so much.
Yeah, well, the the reservoir itself was rebuilt for 8 miles further upstream as part of a new resettlement effort. And Sheffield itself, obviously, as a major city, wasn't able to just stop because of the crisis, especially because obviously without refrigeration and other advanced storage techniques, the city had to keep on functioning, otherwise it would run out of food quite quickly. So it was definitely a case of the next day life had to go on. And it was a difficult situation for everyone, but they were reliant on outside relief efforts to a degree. Oh, sorry, I think you're on mute.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Zoe asks, how long did it take for Sheffield to recover and rebuild from the flood? Were the surrounding villages that were destroyed resettled?
Oh, great question. So the answer is it varied. Most of the villages were rebuilt. Isolated farms tended to be rebuilt because the landowners, if they survived, still owned the valuable agricultural land. So that was a case of some of them had to take on loans or sell off the land to have it resettled. But in the main, you would expect the farmland to be back in production within a year. In Sheffield itself, obviously the big push was for the factory owners to get their factory sites back online. There was a lot of support for that from local councils. So again, that was in a matter of weeks, you would expect to see most of the industrialist sites in some form coming back or being bought up if the business had gone bankrupt because the stock had been destroyed or the equipment. Nothing was really operating at full capacity for a few months. Obviously, things had to be shipped in if specialist machinery had been lost. There was a good effort to rebuild bridges as well. The people that really suffered were mostly in the slum areas because not much relief was made available for them. And the building quality was often quite appalling. So sometimes there was the difficult case of saying, well, some of these houses have lost entire walls and it's not worth rebuilding. They need to be cleared and sold to commercial developers, with the inevitable consequence that a lot of poor people were just turfed off to make their own way in the world, and some rich landlords made bank, which was quite depressing.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. Well, does anyone else have any questions? We're at the 9-minute mark. Um, so I'll expand it a little and say, what do you think would you, let me think of how to phrase this, but what sort of, are there any comparable types of situations that you would point to that occurred either in the Victorian era or in different eras? And were there, yeah, well, starting off, what situations were there?
Well, in the Victorian era, flooding was a big problem, and I think probably the comparable events were actually in mines and railway tunnels, which were hugely susceptible to flooding. And Victorian engineering really became a triumph of water management. It was amazing just what they could drain out from floods. But there were instances of mine collapsing under floods, and flooding underground was particularly feared, and it was a terrifying experience for the miners, knowing that your life depended on the steam engines keeping pumps going. In terms of other disasters, there were some very horrific railway disasters. For instance, the collapse of the Tay Bridge, which was up in Scotland, where the bridge was in a storm, and sadly the engineers had underestimated the strength of the winds that could come up and cause vibrations on the bridge. And there was a train on the bridge at the time, and it was an enormous disaster with hundreds of people killed as the train and bridge collapsed. And I think in modern times, the thing that always scares me is if you ever are interested in civil engineering disasters, the plans around the Hoover Dam if it ever collapsed, which is an absolute nightmare that would spread all the way down as far as, I think, as far as Phoenix, would wipe out local towns. And I always think to myself, if I live somewhere, one of the things I always do is assess the area for flood risk. Um, I know it's not a sexy thing to do as a homeowner, but I think that would be my advice to people interested in the subject would be think about what you would do if there was a flood. If you had 3, 4 minutes to get out of your house before the flood waters hit, what would you do and how would you manage it?
Yeah. What would you do? How would you manage it?
Yeah, it's a terrifying question. I mean, I think the thing to do is to remember that even 30 centimeters of flood water can move you in a car straight off your feet. So it's incredibly dangerous to be on the streets. So really, you want to ask yourself, can I get to my roof? Can I keep warm and drink and eat whilst I'm up there? Um, and so a waterproof grab bag, torches, one of those fire drop ladders, anything like that that gives you that time to get out, get the space, and wait for the emergency responders. Know your local areas, civil emergency plans. I think in the USA you have a great website. Is it FEMA or the FD, whichever one of them does your? It has an
FEMA.
incredible website. It's a really great resource, and I'd highly recommend it.
Um, that was awesome. We're at the 5-minute mark, so if we don't have any questions, we can wrap it up. But thank you so much. This is really interesting, and I love the stories of heroism, but wow, that was very, very, it's awful, actually.
Well, thank you. It's been lovely to be here, and I hope everyone enjoys all of the other speakers because there's some really great topics, and I'm looking forward to your one on gunpowder.
Oh, thanks. Yeah, fortunately, less destruction, even though that was not the intention. All right. Well, I will see you at different places today. And yeah, really wonderful talk. Thank you.
My pleasure. Thank you, everyone.
Bye.
Have a great day. Bye.